Hi, my name is Anne-Marie Finsas, and I'm currently a pastor of spiritual formation in a local church and have been an adjunct professor at Bethel Seminary for over a decade. It's my privilege to join you in this Engaged certificate to encourage you in your spiritual formation. This part of the certificate is about you and your relationship with God. Too often, those of us who serve in ministry tend the souls of others and struggle to find the time to tend to our own souls. The relentless demands of ministry overwhelm us and leave us little time to be with God, the very one whom we're inviting others to encounter. For many years, I served as a children's and family ministry leader like you, and it seemed that more was always better in ministry. More events, more activities, more ministry, and more can be good until more is too much for the one soul we really need to tend, that is our own. It was in the midst of one of my own crises of doing more that I read this quote by Henry Nouwen. Nouwen writes, "It is a painful fact indeed to realize how poorly prepared most Christian leaders prove to be when they are invited to be spiritual leaders in the true sense. Most of them are used to thinking in terms of large-scale organization, getting people together in churches, schools, and hospitals, and running the show as a circus director. They have become unfamiliar with, and even somewhat afraid of, the deep and significant movements of the Spirit." Ouch. As a children's pastor, I knew firsthand what Nouwen meant when he wrote, "running the show as a circus director." This quote confronted me, but more importantly, it named a longing within me, the longing to simply be with God and learn the deep and significant movements of the Spirit. I wanted something more, and it was then that I began hearing about another way to do leadership, a way that made space for my soul to be with God, a way that included something called spiritual disciplines. And it sounded a little scary at first. Disciplines sounded somewhat legalistic, and I was already really good at doing that. But it also sounded inviting, a way to press pause to my life and simply be with God. Eventually, I learned that spiritual disciplines were simply practices that gave God access to my soul so that God might transform me. Jeanette Baki calls spiritual disciplines any practice that helps us listen to and follow God. So disciplines are just practices, not grit your teeth to get it right practices, but something to, practice, but not to get perfect. Recently, I decided I wanted to learn something new, and so I began to learn lettering, a sort of freehand calligraphy. My first attempt was hilarious. The exercise I was given to write was practice makes progress. Here's what mine looked like. Without even thinking, I wrote practice makes perfect. Then I tried doing it right again. I finally got it on the third try, but it sure looks like I could use some practice. But not to get perfect. Our spiritual practices are not actually the point. We're not praying to get perfect at praying. We're not reading our Bible to get perfect at understanding the Bible. We're not making room for quiet just to get perfect at getting quiet. All our spiritual practices are not to get perfect. We practice spiritual disciplines in order to listen to God and to follow Him. Richard Foster writes, "Spiritual disciplines allow us to place ourselves before God so that He can transform us. Our spiritual practices bring us into God's presence so God can change us, transform us, make us into Christ's likeness." Ruth Haley Barton writes, "Spiritual practices are ways of arranging our lives for spiritual transformation. Our part is to come into God's presence. God's part is to transform us. Spiritual practices don't transform us, God does." So what, you may be asking, are these spiritual practices? Well, anything that helps us listen to and follow God. The classical spiritual disciplines include prayer, Bible reading, reviewing our lives, and spiritual companionship. But there are also many other spiritual practices that bring us into God's presence. Rest, silence and solitude, journaling, prayer walking, intercession, hospitality, simplicity, gratitude. Have you ever thought that one of God's invitations to you might be to rest? Literally, to nap? Some of us could do with a gentle nap in God's presence. But God is inviting us through any practice simply to make space to be with God. Early on in my journey with God, my spiritual director invited me to spend 5 minutes of doing nothing every day. Not praying, not reading, not doing anything. My spiritual practice was simply to do 5 minutes of nothing, which is really hard. I needed that spiritual practice. I needed to push pause on my life and realize that the world would keep spinning without any effort on my part. It made me understand that God is God and I am not. That's a spiritual discipline, something that reminds us of who we are and whose we are. Maybe one of your spiritual disciplines will be to turn off the radio in your car to create some intentional quiet in your life. Or journaling 3 things you're grateful for every night before you go to bed. Or eliminating the word should in your conversation with yourself or others. Or inking in, not penciling in, days off to give yourself some margin in life. Ask God for His invitations to you. Again, the purpose of our spiritual disciplines are to allow God avenues into our lives to change us. Spiritual transformation is not a DIY project. It's God's work to awaken. It's God's work to complete. Our work is simply to respond. Paul writes in Philippians, "Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." That's our part, working out our salvation with spiritual disciplines. For it is God who works in you to will and to work according to His good purpose, that is, to transform us. And when we respond to God, we find ourselves becoming more and more like Jesus. We are being formed into the likeness of Christ. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, "And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory are being transformed into His likeness with ever increasing glory." Christ is being formed in us. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, writes Paul in Galatians. Our spiritual practices invite us into God's presence so that we can be transformed into the likeness of Jesus. And how do we know we're becoming more like Jesus? Well, here's a litmus test. Just ask yourself, am I more loving, more kind, more forgiving, more self-controlled, more any of the fruit of the Spirit than I was last year? If so, you're becoming more like Jesus. We'll never arrive until we see Jesus face to face. But until then, we choose to arrange our lives in order to make space to meet with God so that He can transform us.